China's Cultural Revolution, I mean, it was a whole decade of just chaos. It's a period of intense upheaval that can feel almost impossible to get your head around. So in this explainer, we're going to try and unpack it.
So how do you even begin to make sense of a political storm that lasted 10 years and just defies any simple timeline? If you try to follow it year by year, you're just going to get lost. It's a mess. But there's a much better way to look at it. Instead of a straight timeline, we can understand this whole decade through the lens of 4 central escalating conflicts or contradictions that really fueled all that chaos.
Okay, so this is basically our roadmap. We'll start by setting up a framework for all this chaos. Then we'll walk through the 4 big conflicts: new power versus the old system, the bureaucrats versus the people, civilians versus the military, and finally, the big one, the dictator versus his own successor. All right, let's jump in.
All right, first up, let's talk about the framework for this chaos.
See, the key thing to get is that the Cultural Revolution wasn't just one singular event. It was more like a series of overlapping conflicts. And they all follow this really tragic pattern. A conflict gets unleashed from the very top, it spirals out into these mass movements and totally uncontrollable violence, and then it gets crushed by an even greater force, which almost always led to purges and horrifying massacres. And you'll see, each new conflict sort of builds on the ruins of the last one.
Okay, that brings us to our first contradiction, the one that really lit the fuse: new power versus the old system.
So where did this all begin? Believe it or not, it started with a play. See, after the total disaster of the Great Leap Forward, Mao Zedong's power was looking a little shaky. He saw rivals everywhere in the party. So he used this historical play, Hai Ri dismissed from office, as his excuse. He claimed it was a secret attack on him, and just like that, he launched a massive purge.
But purging his rivals wasn't enough. Mao needed an army, so he unleashed the youth, specifically the kids of the revolutionary elites, who were known as the Red Second Generation. Now, you gotta remember, these were teenagers, university students, children of high-ranking officials who had grown up in peacetime. They were restless. They craved that revolutionary glory their parents always talked about, and they were desperate for a way to grab some power for themselves. And Mao? He gave them their cause.
And this quote, wow, it just perfectly captures their mindset. The world is ours, the country is ours, society is ours. If we do not take charge, who will? They really felt it was their birthright to rule. So armed with Mao's personal blessing, they organized themselves into the now infamous Red Guards and launched a nationwide assault on what they called the Old World.
Their mission? To smash the 4 olds: old ideas, culture, customs, and habits. Famous writers like Lao Shi were hounded to death. Priceless temples and ancient artifacts were just smashed to bits. But the violence didn't stop there. It very quickly escalated from destroying things to organize absolutely brutal attacks on people.
This is a horrifying account from what's known as Red August in 1966. With the police basically giving them a green light, Red Guards carried out these systematic massacres in Beijing. Their targets were families with bad class backgrounds, anyone labeled a landlord or a rich peasant or a counter-revolutionary. This was the brutal, terrifying climax of that first contradiction.
And all that violence, it leads us right into the second major conflict: the bureaucrats versus the people. See, there was this deep resentment that had been simmering just below the surface for years, and Mao was about to throw a match on it.
So here's the irony. The Communist Party was constantly preaching equality, right? But in reality, it had created a whole new ruling class. The high-ranking officials, they'd become this privileged elite, living a life that was completely separate from ordinary folks. And the scale of this new inequality was, well, it was staggering. Just look at this. By 1956, the wage gap inside the Communist Party bureaucracy was more than double what it had been under the very government they had overthrown. And trust me, this privilege went way beyond just a salary. You had top officials getting access to special, high-quality food. They called it taegong, even during the Great Famine when millions were starving. They had exclusive resorts, private clubs, and maybe most importantly, they had the political power to just ruin anyone's life with the stroke of a pen. This created this deep, deep well of anger among regular people. And Mao, he decided to use it.
So Mao basically tells the masses, the workers, the students, the low-level guys, to bombard the headquarters, to attack the party itself. This all comes to a head in the Anting incident near Shanghai. You've got these rebel workers, led by a guy named Wang Hongwen, who shut down China's most important railway line. Total paralysis. So they send in a top official, Zhang Chunqiao, to fix it. And he does something absolutely shocking. He sides with the workers. He declares their rebel group legal. And that just opened the floodgates. Society completely fractured into thousands of warring factions.
And that fracture, well, it leads us directly into our third and, frankly, most violent contradiction: civilians versus the military.
By 1967, the country had pretty much spiraled into what was effectively a civil war. You had these rebel factions fighting conservative factions all over the place. The chaos really peaked during the Wuhan incident, where a local military commander just openly defied Beijing's authority and Mao himself had to flee the city. It was a huge, glaring sign that he had completely lost control of the monster he'd created.
And listen, this wasn't just street fighting with sticks and stones. In cities like Chongqing, these factions were waging full-on battles with tanks, heavy artillery, even gunboats on the river. So, to end the chaos, Mao makes this fateful decision. He orders the People's Liberation Army to take over. And in doing so, he completely abandons the very rebel factions that he himself had unleashed just a year or two before.
What came next was maybe the single deadliest phase of the entire Cultural Revolution. The military, now totally in charge, launched this ruthless campaign to cleanse the class ranks. The rebels, who were once celebrated as revolutionary heroes, were now being hunted down, tortured, and killed by the thousands. I mean, this period saw horrific massacres, and in the province of Guangxi, there was even state-sanctioned, systematic cannibalism of their defeated enemies. It's just beyond horrifying. So, with the whole country now basically under military rule, the conflict moves. It retreats from the streets and goes back into the halls of power. And this is where we see the final core contradiction of the whole system: the dictator versus his own successor.
Mao was completely obsessed with his legacy. He was terrified that after he died, his successor would betray him. Just like Khrushchev had denounced Stalin back in the Soviet Union. But here's the central paradox. Anybody powerful and competent enough to actually succeed him was by definition also powerful enough to be a threat to him. And so, he destroyed them, one by one. First, it was Liu Shaoqi, then his hand-picked heir and military chief Lin Biao, who dies in this mysterious plane crash after an alleged coup attempt. The list just goes on and on.
So when Mao finally dies in 1976, the Cultural Revolution doesn't end with some grand finale or another revolution. Nope, it ends with a quiet palace coup. His very last hand-picked successor, a guy named Hua Guofeng, teams up with the military to arrest Mao's most radical followers, his wife Jiang Qing and the rest of the Gang of Four. And just like that, a decade of turmoil was over.
But here's what you really should take away from this part: how the history got written. It was written by the victors. The bureaucrats who had been viciously attacked, they all came back into power. And the chaos of the last 10 years? Oh, that was all blamed on a few bad apples: the Gang of Four and the conveniently dead Lin Biao. The deeper systemic issues, the very contradictions that we've been talking about that fueled all that violence, they were just papered over, swept under the rug.
And that, right there, is the central, lingering question that the source material really leaves us with. The specific, chaotic form of the Cultural Revolution, that's probably not going to be repeated. But what about the soil that it grew in? The absolute concentration of power in one leader, the total collapse of the rule of law, and complete control over information, are those things really in the past? That's the question we're left to ponder.